All hatches, stay alert. I don't like this fog. Wilco, moving up now.
We're approaching the objective. Stay alert. The jungle is thick up ahead. Able 6, this is Dog Company. We have eyes on the target at 045. Moving up slowly. Over.
January 1942. A humid morning drapes over a muddy clearing in New Guinea. The air is thick with the scent of wet earth and burning diesel. Somewhere beyond the dense jungle, the distant roar of engines grows louder, punctuated by sharp, metallic clanks and the staccato chatter of gunfire. A squad of American M3 Stuart tanks emerges, moving in precise formation. Each hull bristles with antennas, a network of invisible lines linking every commander, every gunner, every driver. Radios hum softly, crackling with orders and confirmations. Commands that once took minutes to reach frontline units now travel instantly. Japanese officers crouch behind a ridge, binoculars pressed to their eyes. Their eyes widen in disbelief. Every tank, every platoon, every unit, they are connected, coordinated, predictable only to their own side. They had never encountered an enemy armored force with communication this seamless. The first exchange of fire echoes through the valley. Smoke curls around trees, and the jungle seems to hold its breath. A single misstep could cascade into disaster. Yet, these radios give Americans a rhythm, a tempo, a control the Japanese had assumed impossible. And in that moment, the balance of command begins to shift. The early months of 1942 were grim for the Allied forces in the Pacific. Japan, having struck with surgical precision at Pearl Harbor just a month prior, was sweeping across Southeast Asia and the islands of the Pacific with astonishing speed. Malaya fell in a matter of weeks. Singapore, once thought impregnable, surrendered under a haze of smoke and shellfire. Japanese forces moved with confidence, fueled by disciplined training and an assumption of superiority, particularly against mechanized units. In the dense jungles and treacherous coastal plains of New Guinea, American forces began to test the limits of their own preparedness. U.S. armor was not yet legendary, but it had quietly evolved in ways that would shock the Japanese. In contrast to the Japanese approach, where tanks were often treated as infantry support tools and communication relied on runners, signal flags, or limited radio sets concentrated only in command tanks, the Americans were integrating radios into every vehicle in a platoon. Commanders in the Pacific knew that jungle warfare would fracture lines, slow infantry, and obscure vision. Radios promised to knit these fragments back together, allowing armored units to respond instantly to unfolding events. On a misted morning along the Owen-Stanley Range, a platoon of American M3 Stuarts crawled along a narrow track, engines muted beneath the sound of dripping water from jungle leaves. The radios clicked and hummed, voices exchanged orders, updates, and reconnaissance in real time. One tank commander could coordinate a flanking maneuver while another signaled a retreat. Everything was synchronized. It was a subtle but decisive difference. Japanese doctrine had not accounted for it. They expected confusion to follow the first roar of artillery or the clatter of a tank track. Yet here was an enemy unit operating with a precision that seemed almost unnatural. American engineers and tactical planners had anticipated this advantage. The development of compact, reliable radios had been slow but deliberate, tied to a recognition that modern warfare was no longer just about firepower or numbers. It was about information. In practice, this meant that a single radio operator could transmit the position, speed, and orders of a unit across a battlefield that would have otherwise required runners risking ambush. The implications were enormous. Artillery could be called with precision. Infantry could pivot instantly, and armor could strike with unity rather than isolated aggression. Japanese commanders, on the other hand, relied on doctrine shaped in conflicts with lightly armed opponents in China, where radio communication was rare and infantry often fought in loosely coordinated waves. Their tanks, such as the Type 95 Ha-Go and Type 97 Chi-Ha, were lightly armored and underpowered compared to even the Stuart, but the true weakness was command. Without radios in every vehicle, coordinating movements under fire became a chaotic exercise in signals and improvisation. When an American platoon slipped through a jungle trail or changed its formation in response to terrain, Japanese units often only realized the maneuver minutes later, minutes in which the outcome was already decided. Along the narrow ridges near the Markham River, a small detachment of Japanese Type 95s had prepared to ambush an approaching U.S. column. Dust rose from the dirt road. The undergrowth whispered with the movement of men and machines. Yet as the Americans entered the kill zone, their tanks were not confused, they were not scattered. Radios kept every hull aware of the other's movements. Orders from the lead tank were received instantaneously by the rearmost unit. Machine guns swept in coordinated arcs. Guns rotated to cover blind spots. The Japanese platoon, expecting disarray, faced instead a seamless, almost choreographed advance. This technological edge was not merely mechanical, it was psychological. Japanese soldiers, trained to expect chaos in enemy formations, found themselves facing an armored unit that moved as if it were a single organism. The radios carried more than orders. They carried certainty. Every adjustment, every repositioning, every signal from a commander reached its intended target without delay. The realization of this capability struck fear and disbelief into officers who had never imagined their adversary could achieve such synchronization. It was here, in these early skirmishes of the Pacific, that the groundwork was laid for a dramatic shift in armored warfare. A simple antenna on a tank's hull, humble and unassuming, became a silent weapon of command. And in the dense jungles and sun-baked trails of New Guinea, where visibility was short and every misstep deadly, that weapon would prove decisive. The stage was set. Japanese assumptions about American disorganization would be tested, and the first encounter would expose a truth that reverberated from the battlefield to the war room. A tank with a radio was no longer just a vehicle. It was a node in a living network of war. While the Americans quietly refined their armored doctrine, Japanese commanders relied on assumptions that had carried them through earlier campaigns. In China and Southeast Asia, their tanks, mostly Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks and the slightly heavier Type 97 Chi-Ha, had performed adequately against poorly equipped opponents. Communication on the battlefield was simple. A few radios in command tanks, signal flags, and runners who risked life and limb to deliver orders. Coordination depended heavily on preset plans, rigid hierarchies, and visual cues. Flexibility under fire was limited. On the morning of February 9th, 1942, near the coastal plains of Buna, Japanese tank crews pushed their vehicles through mud-soaked trails, eyes scanning for signs of American resistance. Commanders relied on shouted orders and hand signals, their confidence bolstered by prior successes. They expected the Americans to be slow, fragmented, and reactive. They had no reason to anticipate the unseen network of radios linking every U.S. tank in the approaching column. The Americans, by contrast, approached with a silent precision. M3 Stuarts slipped between palms of swaying palms and stunted jungle trees, engines muffled beneath the ambient drone of insects and distant artillery. Radio operators relayed commands instantaneously. Advance 30 meters. Hold fire. Flank left. Engage target. The coordination was invisible to the Japanese eye, but immediately felt in the outcome of every maneuver. Tanks rotated to cover one another, machine guns maintained suppressive fire, and gunners adjusted aim based on real-time intelligence from a lead vehicle. Japanese doctrine had failed to account for the speed and clarity of communication that these radios offered. Plans that might have relied on careful reconnaissance and slow, deliberate movement were now obsolete. When U.S. tanks suddenly changed direction or concentrated firepower on a single target, Japanese units were forced to react without coordination. Orders from battalion headquarters often arrived too late, and by then, the Americans had already exploited every weakness. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese officers, trained to value discipline and prearranged tactics, faced a battlefield in which their calculations were consistently outpaced. Tanks they expected to move separately struck together. Infantry cover that should have blocked an advance was bypassed. Reports from survivors noted bewilderment at how Americans seemed to anticipate terrain challenges, enemy positions, and each other's intentions. Every radio transmission that crackled through the jungle air was a thread in a web that Japanese commanders could not untangle. Meanwhile, U.S. tank crews, many of them young and inexperienced, felt a sense of control that their Japanese counterparts lacked. The radios did more than transmit orders. They connected minds across space and chaos. A platoon leader could witness the battlefield unfolding from multiple perspectives: a gunner's view, a scout's report, and intelligence from other units. Decisions that once took precious minutes were made instantly, and coordinated execution followed without hesitation. The jungle, the mud, the smoke, all obstacles to less connected units, became manageable. By March 1942, the contrast had become undeniable. In engagements across New Guinea, American armored units moved with a cohesion that Japanese forces could not match. Even the Type 97, superior in armor to the Stewart in some respects, could not compensate for the fragmented command structure and limited communication. Japanese attempts to outflank or ambush American tanks were repeatedly thwarted by real-time coordination, and their reliance on runners and pre-planned maneuvers left them reacting rather than initiating. In isolated battlefields, the effect was magnified. Dense jungle, cratered trails, and hidden ridges that could have favored defenders now amplified the Americans' advantage. Each radio became a lifeline, each tank a node in a living network capable of adapting to unfolding events. Japanese officers, watching through binoculars as tanks appeared from unexpected directions, firing in unison, and retreating in perfect synchronization, could scarcely comprehend the technology behind the method. It was here, in these early encounters, that the gulf between assumption and reality became painfully clear. Japanese commanders' disbelief was not arrogance. It was shock at a capability they had never imagined. The presence of radios in every American tank did not merely enhance firepower or mobility. It redefined the very nature of command. The battlefield was no longer a chaotic melee, but a structured, responsive system in which the Americans dictated tempo, exploited terrain, and forced reaction at every turn. This clash of doctrines, rigid Japanese assumptions versus dynamic American coordination, set the stage for the first true test of the radio's battlefield advantage. And in that crucible, every decision, every maneuver, and every transmission would determine not only the outcome of the engagement, but also the perception of modern armored warfare for both sides. The battlefield is more than mud and steel. It is human nerve and reaction, where split-second decisions carry life or death. For the American tank crews in New Guinea, the presence of radios transformed the way they perceive combat. Private First Class James Carter, a gunner in an M3 Stewart, later recalled the almost surreal clarity the devices brought. One moment, he could be focused on the enemy's skirmish in front of him. The next, a commander's voice guided him around an unseen ridge, alerted him to a hidden trench, or redirected fire to protect advancing infantry. The radios were not just tools, they were extensions of their senses. Confidence replaced hesitation. Coordination replaced confusion. Every maneuver felt deliberate, rehearsed, even in the chaos of jungle warfare. From a tactical standpoint, the radios allowed the Americans to impose a rhythm on engagements that Japanese forces struggled to comprehend. In a narrow pass near the Markham River, a platoon of 5 Stuarts approached a Japanese ambush. The enemy relied on terrain and surprise, expecting confusion to splinter American lines. Yet through radios, the lead tank transmitted precise commands: split formation, cover left flank, suppress enemy to the ridge, hold fire until visual confirmation. Within seconds, the entire platoon adjusted its positions, guns sweeping in coordinated arcs. When the ambush erupted, the Japanese were met not with scattered targets, but a synchronized counterattack. Tanks moved as one, machine guns suppressed, and infantry advanced under the cover of precision fire. The battle unfolded almost like a dance, a deadly, fluid choreography made possible by invisible lines of communication. Technologically, the radios themselves were a marvel of practical design. Compact, rugged, and mounted in every vehicle, they functioned reliably even under the relentless humidity, mud, and vibration of jungle combat. Engineers had solved problems that had long plagued armored units: signal interference, battery life, and durability in harsh conditions. The Americans did not need enormous command vehicles or elaborate infrastructure. Each tank became a node in an adaptable network. This network allowed leaders to see the battlefield in near real time, make adjustments, and relay intelligence without delay. The radios were more than convenience. They were force multipliers, converting each tank from an isolated weapon into part of a living, breathing system. On the human side, the impact extended beyond coordination to morale. Soldiers who had previously relied on shouted orders or chaotic hand signals found solace in knowing that help, direction, and information were always within reach. In contrast, Japanese soldiers faced mounting uncertainty. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of a Type 95 platoon described watching American tanks maneuvering with uncanny precision. It was as if they knew where we would be before we moved. This realization, the fear of being perpetually outmaneuvered, eroded confidence, slowed decision-making, and intensified panic under fire. The psychological edge was subtle but potent. Radios were not firing rounds, but they were shaping perception, control, and fear. Even leadership decisions benefited immeasurably. U.S. commanders could issue orders while maintaining situational awareness across miles of dense jungle. In a July skirmish near Buna, Captain Samuel Lewis coordinated 3 platoons with a single voice transmitted through radios, directing fire, repositioning units, and adapting to Japanese counterattacks in real time. Such flexibility was unheard of in prior engagements, where orders could take hours to reach the front line. The radios allowed leaders to respond dynamically rather than react passively. The battlefield became a space where initiative, once fragmented by terrain and distance, was concentrated and multiplied. The enemy perspective adds another angle: disbelief and miscalculation. Japanese doctrine had presumed that American armor would be slow, fragmented, and predictable. When the M3 Stuarts executed unexpected maneuvers, flanking, splitting, converging, the Japanese were caught in a web of invisible signals. Attempts to coordinate counterattacks were delayed by reliance on runners and limited radios, while the Americans adjusted with instant communication. Observing the synchronized movements, Japanese officers struggled to issue orders quickly enough to match the pace. Each failed maneuver reinforced the perception of an almost preternatural enemy, and the psychological strain mounted with each passing engagement. By combining human experience, tactical innovation, and technological ingenuity, the radios transformed armored warfare into something the Japanese had never anticipated. Each tank was no longer an individual unit. Each platoon became a single, responsive organism. Every decision, every adjustment, Every volley of fire was part of a unified strategy executed in real time. The battlefield shifted from chaos to structured engagement, with Americans dictating tempo and Japanese forces scrambling to respond. As these battles continued, the combination of human adaptability, tactical precision, and technological advantage created a feedback loop. Soldiers trusted the radios, commanders relied on the information, and units moved with confidence. In contrast, Japanese units, deprived of similar tools, were forced into reactive, fragmented movements. The stage was set for a turning point, where coordination and communication would decide victory or defeat in the jungle battles of 1942. The battlefield is more than mud and steel. It is human nerve and reaction, where split-second decisions carry life or death. For the American tank crews in New Guinea, the presence of radios transformed the way they perceive combat. Private First Class James Carter, a gunner in an M3 Stuart, later recalled the almost surreal clarity the devices brought. One moment, he could be focused on the enemy's skirmish in front of him. The next, a commander's voice guided him around an unseen ridge, alerted him to a hidden trench, or redirected fire to protect advancing infantry. The radios were not just tools. They were extensions of their senses. Confidence replaced hesitation. Coordination replaced confusion. Every maneuver felt deliberate, rehearsed, even in the chaos of jungle warfare. From a tactical standpoint, the radios allowed the Americans to impose a rhythm on engagements that Japanese forces struggled to comprehend. In a narrow pass near the Markham River, a platoon of 5 Stuarts approached a Japanese ambush. The enemy relied on terrain and surprise, expecting confusion to splinter American lines. Yet through radios, the lead tank transmitted precise commands: split formation, cover left flank, suppress enemy to the ridge, hold fire until visual confirmation. Within seconds, the entire platoon adjusted its positions, guns sweeping in coordinated arcs. When the ambush erupted, the Japanese were met not with scattered targets, but a synchronized counterattack. Tanks moved as one, machine guns suppressed, and infantry advanced under the cover of precision fire. The battle unfolded almost like a dance, a deadly, fluid choreography made possible by invisible lines of communication. Technologically, the radios themselves were a marvel of practical design. Compact, rugged, and mounted in every vehicle, they functioned reliably even under the relentless humidity, mud, and vibration of jungle combat. Engineers had solved problems that had long plagued armored units: signal interference, battery life, and durability in harsh conditions. The Americans did not need enormous command vehicles or elaborate infrastructure. Each tank became a node in an adaptable network. This network allowed leaders to see the battlefield in near real time, make adjustments, and relay intelligence without delay. The radios were more than convenience. They were force multipliers, converting each tank from an isolated weapon into part of a living, breathing system. On the human side, the impact extended beyond coordination to morale. Soldiers who had previously relied on shouted orders or chaotic hand signals found solace in knowing that help, direction, and information were always within reach. In contrast, Japanese soldiers faced mounting uncertainty. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of a Type 95 platoon described watching American tanks maneuvering with uncanny precision. It was as if they knew where we would be before we moved. This realization, the fear of being perpetually outmaneuvered, eroded confidence, slowed decision-making, and intensified panic under fire. The psychological edge was subtle but potent. Radios were not firing rounds, but they were shaping perception, control, and fear. Even leadership decisions benefited immeasurably. U.S. commanders could issue orders while maintaining situational awareness across miles of dense jungle. In a July skirmish near Buna, Captain Samuel Lewis coordinated 3 platoons with a single voice transmitted through radios, directing fire, repositioning units, and adapting to Japanese counterattacks in real time. Such flexibility was unheard of in prior engagements, where orders could take hours to reach the front line. The radios allowed leaders to respond dynamically rather than react passively. The battlefield became a space where initiative, once fragmented by terrain and distance, was concentrated and multiplied. The enemy perspective adds another angle: disbelief and miscalculation. Japanese doctrine had presumed that American armor would be slow, fragmented, and predictable. When the M3 Stuarts executed unexpected maneuvers, flanking, splitting, converging, the Japanese were caught in a web of invisible signals. Attempts to coordinate counterattacks were delayed by reliance on runners and limited radios, while the Americans adjusted with instant communication. Observing the synchronized movements, Japanese officers struggled to issue orders quickly enough to match the pace. Each failed maneuver reinforced the perception of an almost preternatural enemy, and the psychological strain mounted with each passing engagement. By combining human experience, tactical innovation, and technological ingenuity, the radios transformed armored warfare into something the Japanese had never anticipated. Each tank was no longer an individual unit. Each platoon became a single, responsive organism. Every decision, every adjustment, every volley of fire was part of a unified strategy executed in real time. The battlefield shifted from chaos to structured engagement, with Americans dictating tempo and Japanese forces scrambling to respond. As these battles continued, the combination of human adaptability, tactical precision, and technological advantage created a feedback loop. Soldiers trusted the radios, commanders relied on the information, and units moved with confidence. In contrast, Japanese units, deprived of similar tools, were forced into reactive, fragmented movements. The stage was set for a turning point, where coordination and communication would decide victory or defeat in the jungle battles of 1942. Leadership, in the chaos of war, is only as effective as the means to transmit intention. 4 U.S. commanders in the Pacific jungles, radios in every tank became a force multiplier unlike any other. Major William Thompson, coordinating a mixed force of infantry and armor near the Monbear River, described the experience in his after-action reports. Orders reached every tank instantly. I could reposition units on the fly, redirect fire, and anticipate the enemy before they realized our intentions. In previous conflicts, commanders relied on messengers and line-of-sight signals, often resulting in delays and miscommunication. In New Guinea, a single command could ripple through a platoon, orchestrating movements across ridges, streams, and hidden trails with precision. The radios made initiative contagious. Every subordinate could act in concert with the commander's intent without losing time. The Japanese perspective, by contrast, was one of shock and frustration. Officers such as Captain Kenji Matsumoto, observing an American armored column from a ridge near Buna, noted how impossible it seemed for the tanks to maintain formation and adapt simultaneously. "They moved like a single body," he reported. "Every maneuver we predicted was already countered." Japanese doctrine emphasized obedience and pre-planned maneuvers, which had worked in the open fields of China and Southeast Asia. But in dense jungle terrain, where visibility was limited and communication hampered by nature itself, the lack of radios in each vehicle turned coordination into chaos. Runners were intercepted, flags obscured, and voice commands lost to distance and foliage. The Americans' technological edge translated directly into tactical dominance, leaving Japanese leaders struggling to regain control in engagements where their forces were outmaneuvered before the first shot was fired. Moral and psychological factors were equally decisive. For American troops, radios were more than tools. They were reassurance, a tether to command and comrades alike. Private First Class Harold Nguyen, a driver in an M3 Stuart platoon, recounted, you never felt alone. Even if the jungle blocked your view, the radio made you part of something bigger. You knew someone was watching your back, guiding your moves. This confidence, grounded in real-time communication, allowed soldiers to act decisively, reduce hesitation under fire, and maintain cohesion in chaotic engagements. For Japanese soldiers, the effect was the opposite. Repeated encounters with synchronized American armor generated disbelief, fear, and erosion of morale. In one engagement near the Mombear River, a small group of Type 95 tanks attempted a flanking maneuver, only to be countered immediately by coordinated fire and repositioning of American Stuarts. Lieutenant Tanaka, observing the failure, wrote in his journal, "No matter what we tried, they were always one step ahead. It was not courage that defeated us. It was coordination we could not see. The inability to predict movements or respond quickly to new threats created an undercurrent of panic that amplified losses and disrupted Japanese formations." From a tactical perspective, the radios allowed a level of adaptability that was revolutionary in jungle warfare. Where Japanese forces relied on static defenses and pre-planned routes, Americans could shift attack vectors, reinforce weak points instantly, and exploit openings as soon as they appeared. The radios functioned as both eyes and voice of command, transmitting intelligence from the periphery to the center and back again. During an engagement near the Buna coast, a lead tank encountered a hidden anti-tank position. A single transmission warned trailing vehicles, adjusted their formation, and coordinated supporting infantry, all before the Japanese gunners could react. What might have been a costly ambush was avoided entirely. Leadership, technology, and human psychology intertwined in these engagements to produce a new kind of battlefield reality. Commanders could execute maneuvers previously thought impossible under jungle conditions. Soldiers gained confidence in their own actions, and the enemy's assumptions were systematically dismantled. The radios transformed every decision into an immediate tactical advantage, collapsing what would have been minutes of hesitation into instantaneous action. Japanese forces struggled not only with the mechanical and tactical implications, but also with the cognitive burden. Predicting American movements became increasingly futile. Officers attempted to regroup, to anticipate, to adapt, but the invisible network of radioed commands rendered traditional Japanese strategies obsolete. Every failed ambush, every frustrated flanking attempt, reinforced a new truth. The Americans were not simply stronger. They were coordinated, informed, and decisive. As these perspectives coalesced, the human confidence of American crews, the tactical precision enabled by technology, the leadership efficiency, and the enemy's growing despair, a clear pattern emerged. Radios were no longer mere equipment. They had become instruments of dominance, shaping every engagement and every perception on the battlefield. The advantages were cumulative. Decisive maneuvers, controlled tempo, and psychological superiority combined to create a force that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. The stage was now set for the turning point of these armored engagements. Japanese commanders, humbled by repeated defeats and confused by their inability to counter instantaneous coordination, faced a decisive clash where radios would not only guide American tanks, but determine the outcome of entire battles. The network of communication that had seemed invisible would prove unstoppable in shaping history on the Pacific Front. August 1942. The dense, humid jungles of Guadalcanal became the stage for a confrontation that would define armored warfare in the Pacific. Japanese forces had landed with confidence, expecting to overrun the poorly equipped Americans with speed and surprise. Tanks and infantry moved along narrow tracks, their commanders relying on preset plans, hand signals, and limited radios that were concentrated in single command vehicles. Every action depended on anticipation and luck, and both would fail. Meanwhile, U.S. forces, though numerically inferior, moved with the unseen advantage of communication. M3 Stuart tanks, each with radios integrated into the hull, advanced cautiously but decisively along forested trails. The lead tank encountered a Japanese ambush near the Ilu River. Machine gun fire cut through the undergrowth. Grenades exploded against hulls, and the underbrush shook with the movement of enemy infantry. Yet the American platoon did not panic. A single transmission from the lead tank orchestrated the response. Suppress left flank. Cover approach. Flank right. Hold fire until target confirmed. Within seconds, every tank adjusted its position, machine guns rotated, and gunners tracked multiple targets simultaneously. The Japanese attack, meant to fragment the American column, failed within minutes. Type 95 Hago tanks attempted to encircle the Stuarts, but coordination lagged behind the reality on the ground. Messages from battalion headquarters trickled in late. Runners were delayed by mud and debris. Hand signals were obscured by dense foliage. In contrast, the American tanks moved as a single entity, reacting instantly to threats, advancing, retreating, and shifting firepower in a fluid rhythm. Where Japanese doctrine relied on pre-planned maneuvers, the Americans adapted continuously. Captain Samuel Lewis, commanding the 2nd Platoon, radioed his artillery forward observer. Target coordinates at Ridge 509. Engage immediately. Adjust left by 15 meters. The response was immediate. Mortars struck the ridge just as the Japanese attempted to reposition their tanks, creating chaos in the enemy formation. The synchronized use of radios extended beyond the armored units, linking infantry and artillery into a cohesive force that struck with timing and precision previously thought impossible in jungle combat. At one critical moment, a small group of Japanese Type 97 Chiha tanks attempted a frontal assault on a river crossing, believing the Americans to be pinned. Through the radios, the lead Stuart commander coordinated a flanking maneuver, signaling, right flank advance, cover rear, prepare suppression fire. The American tanks rotated, shifted positions, and converged on the attacking force, bringing a concentrated volley to bear. The Japanese tanks, lightly armored and uncoordinated, were destroyed or forced into retreat. The action lasted barely 10 minutes, but it demonstrated the lethal advantage of constant communication in every vehicle. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was immediate and devastating. Major Hiroshi Takeda, observing from a ridge, later described the scene in his diary. They moved in unison, each tank knowing what the other would do. Every tactic we employed was countered before we could act. It was as if they were linked by some invisible force. We could not comprehend it. The disorientation and disbelief were compounded by the relentless efficiency of the American network. Every failed attempt to coordinate counterattacks amplified confusion, creating a cascade of tactical errors. Meanwhile, American crews moved with an almost choreographed rhythm. In the heart of the jungle, radios crackled incessantly. Confirmations, warnings, requests, and commands flew between tanks and infantry. Gunners adjusted fire based on real-time updates. Commanders relayed movements from one side of the battlefield to the other. Terrain that should have been an obstacle, the mud, the narrow trails, the undergrowth, became a factor the Americans exploited, using instant communication to navigate safely, flank hidden positions, and coordinate supporting fire. The jungle itself became a stage for the precision enabled by technology. As the sun rose over the Guadalcanal ridges, the first major encounter between fully radio-equipped U.S. tanks and Japanese armored units reached its crescendo. Japanese forces, scattered, demoralized, and outmaneuvered, retreated in disarray. American tanks, maintaining formation and coordination, advanced with calculated steps, consolidating positions, and preparing for the next engagement. The radios had dictated the tempo, controlled the rhythm of combat, and transformed uncertainty into dominance. By the end of the day, The battlefield bore the scars of jungle warfare, wrecked Japanese tanks, trampled undergrowth, and a lingering smoke of coordinated artillery strikes. Yet the true victory was invisible. It was the network of command and communication, the silent threads of the radios, that had rendered numerical advantage irrelevant, that had made speed, precision, and morale decisive factors. The Japanese assumption that American armor would be slow and fragmented was shattered. The reality was clear. The radios had redefined armored warfare in the Pacific. By late August 1942, the struggle for Guadalcanal had escalated into a brutal contest of coordination, firepower, and endurance. Japanese forces, expecting the Americans to be disorganized, launched repeated attacks to seize the coastal airstrips. Each assault, however, ran into the invisible barrier of radio-coordinated armor. The M3 Stuart platoons moved like a single organism, anticipating ambushes, adjusting formations, and linking with infantry and artillery in real time. During one engagement near the Ilu River Delta, a Japanese battalion attempted a flanking maneuver with a combination of Type 95 and Type 97 tanks. They hoped to isolate a single American platoon and overwhelm it before reinforcements could arrive. What they did not anticipate was that every American tank had a direct line to command. The lead Stuart radioed the countermeasure: left flank, engage at will. Rear guard, cover riverbank. Coordinate with artillery, fire when ready. Within moments, every tank responded. Guns pivoted, machine guns swept lanes, and artillery struck precisely at the exposed Japanese flanking units. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. Type 95s, lightly armored and outmaneuvered, were destroyed or forced to retreat, while the heavier Type 97s were isolated and destroyed one by one. Each failed attack reinforced a grim pattern. The Japanese could strike, but the Americans would always anticipate, adjust, and neutralize the threat. Even well-trained officers found themselves paralyzed by the inability to transmit orders rapidly to their units. By nightfall, the Japanese were not merely repelled. They were decisively broken in that sector. American leadership exploited this advantage relentlessly. Captain Samuel Lewis, now commanding multiple platoons, used radio coordination to rotate units out of combat, resupply positions, and maintain continuous pressure on the retreating enemy. The radios allowed him to see the battlefield from multiple perspectives, adapt strategy mid-engagement, and anticipate Japanese countermoves before they materialized. In effect, every tank became an extension of command, every crew member an informed participant in the unfolding strategy. The impact was as psychological as it was tactical. Japanese soldiers reported confusion and disbelief. Lieutenant Tanaka, observing the annihilation of his flanking group, wrote, "It was as though we were invisible, and yet every move we made was countered instantly. They had eyes everywhere, yet we could not see them." The radios transformed the battlefield into a controlled environment for the Americans, where Japanese tactics, built on assumptions of surprise and disorganization, repeatedly failed. The turning point came during the Battle of the Tenaru River. A Japanese regiment attempted a night assault, aiming to overwhelm an isolated American position. M3 Stuarts, linked by radios, coordinated with infantry patrols and pre-registered artillery points. As Japanese troops advanced under cover of darkness, the American tanks rotated into firing positions, guided by real-time intelligence. Machine guns tore through advancing formations. Artillery and direct fire from Stuart's decimated armored support. Within hours, the assault collapsed entirely, leaving survivors scattered and morale shattered. By the end of August, the operational advantage was undeniable. The American forces had leveraged radios not as a convenience, but as a force-multiplying weapon. They dictated the tempo of battle, controlled engagement zones, and maintained cohesion in terrain that traditionally favored defenders. Japanese commanders, constrained by limited communication and rigid doctrine, were consistently forced into reactive, fragmented actions. Each lost engagement reinforced a critical truth. Radio-equipped tanks were not merely superior in firepower or armor. They were coordinated instruments of command, intelligence, and psychological dominance. The aftermath of these engagements reshaped the Pacific battlefield. American commanders gained confidence in exploiting technology for tactical advantage. Japanese forces were forced to rethink doctrine, often without sufficient time or resources to adapt. Reports from officers on both sides underscored the revolutionary impact of communication networks. Historians would later cite these battles as early examples of information-driven warfare, where command, rather than sheer numbers, decided outcomes. By the time the sun set over Guadalcanal's ridges, the jungle was littered with the detritus of mechanized conflict. Wrecked Japanese tanks, churned mud, and smoldering artillery positions. Yet the invisible victory, the radios, remained intact, humming quietly in each American tank. They had transformed a small, under-resourced force into a synchronized, adaptive strike machine. The Japanese assumption that American armor was disorganized had been shattered beyond repair. In these critical days, the course of armored warfare, at least in the Pacific, had been irrevocably altered. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The broader consequences of these battles, the human and strategic costs, and the lessons that would echo through the rest of the Pacific campaign. The radios had not only won engagements, they had reshaped the way armies would fight, think, and survive in the dense jungles of the Pacific. The jungle of Guadalcanal lay quiet, though scarred, as the first light of dawn crept over the ridges. Smoke still drifted from wrecked Japanese tanks, their twisted hulls half buried in mud and undergrowth. The roar of engines had faded, leaving only the distant calls of birds and the murmur of surviving soldiers gathering themselves. American tanks, their radios still faintly crackling, moved cautiously through the jungle, checking positions and relaying updates to headquarters. The battle had ended, but its effects rippled far beyond the immediate battlefield. For Japanese forces, the toll was devastating. Entire units were decimated, with Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha tanks destroyed or abandoned. Casualties among infantry were heavy. Officers struggled to regroup, sending runners through dangerous terrain to re-establish contact with surviving formations. Morale was shattered. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka described the aftermath in his journal. "We had trained, planned, and believed in our doctrine. Yet every move was anticipated, every flank countered. What we had assumed to be chaos on the enemy's side was, in truth, order beyond our comprehension." For the Japanese, the realization that radios in every tank allowed the Americans to see, react, and coordinate instantly marked a profound turning point in the psychological landscape of war. American troops, by contrast, emerged with a sense of confidence tempered by exhaustion. The M3 Stuarts, though lightly armored, had proven their worth not by brute force alone, but through connectivity. Each radio had functioned as a lifeline, linking platoons, integrating infantry and artillery, and allowing commanders to maintain clarity amid chaos. Soldiers reported reduced hesitation under fire, an ability to anticipate threats, and a cohesion previously impossible in the dense jungle. Private First Class James Carter later recalled, "We felt in control. Even in the mud, under the trees, under fire, we knew what everyone else was doing. That certainty, it saved lives and won battles." The operational consequences extended beyond a single engagement. Japanese officers were forced to reconsider their entire armor doctrine. Pre-planned maneuvers, reliance on limited communication, and assumptions about enemy disorganization were exposed as weaknesses. Strategic reports from surviving Japanese commanders acknowledged the shock of encountering an enemy whose tanks were all connected. "We underestimated their command capability," one report noted. Our tactics, effective elsewhere, failed here. The networked American tanks moved with precision we could not match. In the American command structure, the lessons were equally transformative. Officers recognized that radios in every vehicle were not merely a convenience. They were a decisive tool, capable of shaping the tempo, coordination, and psychology of engagements. In post-battle debriefs, commanders emphasized that instantaneous communication allowed for greater adaptability than numbers or firepower alone. When the next engagement came, plans were made with this network in mind. Artillery and infantry could operate in synchrony with armor, and commanders could pivot quickly in response to enemy movements. The Guadalcanal campaign became a proving ground for the concept of information-driven warfare in jungle conditions. Human consequences also shaped the aftermath. Japanese soldiers who survived were haunted by the precision and coordination of their opponents. Reports describe a mix of fear, disbelief, and demoralization. Entire platoons hesitated during the next encounters, anticipating traps and overestimating the Americans' capabilities. Conversely, American troops carried a heightened sense of unity. Communication through radios fostered trust, not only in leaders but in each other. Soldiers learned to rely on signals and updates, developing instinctive awareness of the battlefield that extended beyond individual lines of sight. This psychological edge, amplified by technology, became as decisive as firepower or terrain. Strategically, the impact reverberated across the Pacific theater. The battles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea demonstrated that an army with smaller numbers but superior communication could outmaneuver larger, conventionally stronger forces. Japanese planners, encountering repeated failures, began to adapt, but progress was slow. Limited industrial capacity, existing doctrine, and the lack of similar technological networks constrained their ability to respond. Meanwhile, American forces continued refining tank communications, expanding radio integration into larger formations, and ensuring that every armored unit could operate as a cohesive system. The battlefield was no longer merely terrain, it was a network. Reports sent back to headquarters emphasized the importance of these lessons. One American memo noted, "Radios in each tank allowed commanders to maintain cohesion under conditions where traditional methods fail." The difference between order and chaos was instantaneous communication. For the Japanese, the lesson was painfully clear. Reliance on rigid plans and partial communication would no longer suffice. The future of armored warfare was no longer about the strength of the steel or the caliber of guns. It was about the flow of information. Beyond doctrine, the aftermath revealed subtle but significant shifts in battlefield ethics and human behavior. Soldiers accustomed to fragmented units now coordinated with precision, reducing unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. Losses were mitigated where communication allowed better coverage and planning. Conversely, Japanese units forced to fight in reactive, disjointed patterns suffered higher casualties and confusion. The radios had created an invisible but lethal advantage, proving that technological adoption could amplify both efficiency and survival. As the smoke cleared over Guadalcanal, historians would later describe the campaign as the first clear demonstration of modern networked warfare in the Pacific. The presence of radios in every American tank had done more than win battles. It had shifted the calculus of command, altered expectations of armored engagement, and introduced a psychological dimension that Japanese forces were unprepared to counter. By the end of the campaign, the consequences were evident in maps, reports, and diaries. Japanese losses in men and armor were substantial. Strategic momentum had shifted in favor of the Allies, and the U.S. military had gained a blueprint for integrating technology, communication, and human decision-making into cohesive operations. Every destroyed Japanese tank and every coordinated American maneuver told the same story. Radios had changed the battlefield forever. The Guadalcanal jungles, once a theater of uncertainty, had become a proving ground for a new kind of warfare, one where command and information flowed as swiftly as bullets. Soldiers, commanders, and historians alike would recognize that the integration of radios into every tank was not a marginal innovation. It was a decisive factor that reshaped the war in the Pacific. And as the American forces prepared for the next campaign, one truth remained. The battlefield belonged to those who could see, speak, and act faster than their enemy. In the quiet aftermath of battle, the radios themselves remained unremarkable, small, unassuming devices mounted on tank hulls, but their impact was profound. They had done more than transmit orders. They had transformed the very nature of warfare. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, where visibility was limited and the chaos of combat threatened to overwhelm even the most disciplined soldiers, these simple instruments created clarity, cohesion, and control. For the Japanese commanders, the realization came slowly and painfully. Armored units without integrated communication were no longer sufficient. The assumption that surprise, speed, or individual bravery could outweigh coordinated action was shattered. They faced a foe that moved not as isolated tanks or scattered platoons, but as a networked organism, each node informed, responsive, and lethal. This was a lesson written in mud, steel, and smoke, and it would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. For American forces, the advantage was both practical and psychological. Radios instilled confidence, enabling soldiers to act decisively, commanders to orchestrate complex maneuvers, and entire units to maintain cohesion under the most punishing conditions. The technology bridged the gap between strategy and execution, turning the jungle into a controlled stage where initiative and communication dictated success. The innovation was simple, yet its effects were profound. It allowed the Americans to fight smarter, faster, and more cohesively than their enemy. Beyond the tactical and operational consequences, the story of radios in every tank reflects a larger truth about warfare itself. Technology shapes not only the weapons we wield, but the decisions we make, the trust we place in one another, and the psychology of the battlefield. It demonstrates how human ingenuity, when paired with clear communication, can amplify courage and skill far beyond raw numbers or firepower. In the end, the battlefields of the Pacific were transformed by an invisible advantage, one that could not be seen in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in the clarity of orders, the synchronization of movement, and the certainty of command. Radios were not just instruments. They were the heartbeat of modern armored warfare, and in their presence, the outcome of battles and the course of history was forever altered.